I think that's the biggest pain that people have, is that they feel, I've undergone something horrific. My home was bombed. 22 members of my family were killed. We're all starving to death right now, eating soup made from leaves. And yet no one hears what is happening to us. Do you know how that would feel, not to have a voice?
Hi everybody, my name is Doug Barr, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the St. Helena Forum for Innovation and Creativity. As most of you know, we are an educational nonprofit with a mission to inform, entertain, and we hope inspire by providing programs featuring a wide variety of humanities-based subjects. Today's presentation will be the first of the 2024 season. Our topic, unfortunately, is a timely one considering the tumultuous world in which we are living. To help us better understand that world, we've invited Janine to Giovanni to join us at the forum. Ms. Giovanni is the author of 8 books, a journalist, a war correspondent, and currently executive director of the Reckoning Project. She earned her BA at the University of Maine and her MFA at the University of Iowa. She began her reporting career in 1987 covering the first Palestinian Intifada for the London Times and The Spectator. Describing herself as a human rights reporter with a focus on war crimes and crimes against humanity, she has reported on genocide in Bosnia, Rwanda, Syria, and was one of the few reporters who witnessed the fall of Grozny and Chechnya. She covered the war in Kosovo with the Kosovo Liberation Army, reported for the Times and Vanity Fair in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then, after becoming the Middle East editor for Newsweek, Janine began reporting in Egypt, Kurdistan, Lebanon, North Africa, and South Sudan. Ms. Giovanni has produced 2 long-form documentary films for the BBC and been featured in or the subject of additional documentaries. In 2018, she was appointed as the Edward R. Murrow Press Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and was also serving as the Adjunct Professor of International and Public Affairs at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. In 2019, DiGiovanni was named a Guggenheim Fellow and a Senior Fellow at Yale University, Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. In 2022, Janine founded the Reckoning Project, a non-governmental organization that trains conflict journalists and researchers to gather legally admissible testimonies documenting war crimes and crimes against humanity committed during the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. For regular forum attendees, you'll no doubt recognize our guest interviewer, David Fried. For the rest of you, let me tell you a bit about our friend Dave. He's a screenwriter, an author, a pilot, and a former award-winning investigative journalist for the Los Angeles Times. He served as the Times' lead police reporter, shared in a Pulitzer Prize for the newspaper's coverage of the 1992 Los Angeles riots, and reported from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq during Operation Desert Storm. He has an extensive reporting background in law enforcement and military affairs, and after leaving the Times, Fried worked as an investigator and associate field producer for the Los Angeles bureau of CBS News, helping cover the O.J. Simpson murder case. In 1995, he sold his first feature-length screenplay, the action thriller called Stealth, to 20th Century Fox, and since then he's written several screenplays and published 6 novels. In addition to his work in Hollywood, Fried has also scripted multiple complex computerized training simulations for the Defense Intelligence Agency, the United States Army's Battle Command Battle Lab, and other entities within the federal intelligence and law enforcement communities. Before we begin, I need to tell you that unlike most of our presentations, this one is a unique insider look at how journalists cover dangerous and violent stories, and some of you should be aware that you may find this conversation disturbing. And now, if everybody is ready, let's listen in on the conversation between Janine DiGiovanni and David Fried.
Janine, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today on the forum about your very important work. I'm honored to spend the next hour or so with you. Perhaps a good starting point might be to help our viewers appreciate your bona fides in covering conflict zones, war zones. Walk us through that evolution. How and when did it all begin for you as a war correspondent?
Well, I think, like most things in life that people find, I did not set out to be a war reporter. I didn't set out to be a journalist, in fact. I was in graduate school in London, and it was the first intifada, which means uprising in Arabic, in Palestine. And I read an article about this extraordinary woman who was a Holocaust survivor, um, a lawyer, a Jewish lawyer in Israel, who at the time was the only Israeli lawyer defending Palestinians in military court. And she just seemed like this extraordinary human being. And I somehow, and this is very much kismet, I got on a plane, I met her. She was called Felicia Langer. She's now no longer with us. And she changed my life forever because I saw someone who had this unbelievable commitment to justice, at any cost, and she believed that people who didn't have a voice should have a voice, that justice had to be delivered to everyone. And she used her skills as a lawyer to do this. But she also introduced me and mentored me to many, many people in the world of human rights documentation and human rights law and basically the human rights world in Gaza, Israel. And she sent me down to Gaza. So it was really my first assignment was there. She introduced me to her best friend, the lawyer Raji Sarani. She introduced me to Israeli activists that had been imprisoned for their incredible work, documenting illegal war crimes. And she just changed my life. And from that moment, I went back to London and I finished my degree, but I no longer wanted to be what I had set out to be, which was a professor of comparative literature.
Hmm.
And I ended up writing a book about Israel Palestine. It was my first book, and by the time I finished, the siege of Sarajevo began. So I went to Bosnia, and during that time, the genocide in Rwanda happened. So I went there, and then basically from that point on, I reported nearly every violent conflict in Africa, the Balkans, and the Middle East. And then after 9/11, it was a whole different set of wars because it was Iraq and Afghanistan, and then the Arab Spring. So I spent many years in Syria, and it led me to do the job I'm doing now, which is the executive director of the Reckoning Project. And we are a war crimes unit in Ukraine.
So, many journalists, myself included, they reach a point in their careers where they grow frustrated by the relatively limited impact of traditional journalism. An investigative reporter's job, and I think virtually every reporter is in one fashion or another an investigator, is to report the facts in hope that someone in authority, someone with agency, will take those facts and take remedial action. Um, to shed light on the dark corners. I think I saw something online where you said you used those words exactly. To correct wrongs, to speak up for people that have no voice. Um, as a reporter, as you well know, one can only carry the ball so far, and you certainly reached that realization in your journalistic career. So take us back to that moment. What was the specific impetus that compelled you to trade the role of objective observer to actually documenting war crimes with the intent of prosecuting the guilty?
I think it was Syria. I think I'm just going to turn that off. I don't know what it is, but I think I should turn off that sound. Um, it was the war in Syria because there was such an immense amount of suffering. And there was the moment, the red line, where the chemical attacks against civilians, Assad's chemical attacks, and Obama promised that would be the red line, and then he backtracked on it. And
This was the barrel bombs that were dropped by.
it was no, I mean, barrel bombs were in Aleppo, but this was when there was a chemical attack in eastern Ghouta, which is a suburb outside of Damascus, where, many people died, children died. It was Assad chemically gassing his own people, and Obama had said the red line will be the use of chemical weapons, and then he didn't. There was no action, and I think for so long, especially wars that are more forgotten, like South Sudan or many African conflicts that were horrific, like Sierra Leone or Ivory Coast, that no one even really hears about. I felt that the impact of journalism was getting less and less loud. During the war in Bosnia, it was, a time before social media, before cell phones. I didn't get a cell phone until the war in Kosovo in 1999. But we did have some kind of effect on policy. I truly believe that my colleagues and I, who were inside Sarajevo during the siege, stayed there, refused to go, kept reporting on the horrors of it, even when it got bypassed by Princess Diana, her antics or whatever she did. And that, I worked for a British newspaper, so I was constantly getting shoved off the front page by Princess Diana or Prince Charles, which was really frustrating because that's what people wanted to read about. They didn't want to read about children starving or people getting their legs amputated without anesthetic. So I slowly began to realize that I needed to go deeper. And then I think the second thing that hit me was that even journalist reporting very often could not be used in court. So these terrible things that many journalists were witnessing and reporting about in a very striking way did not necessarily mean that it would lead to an indictment of someone. So I realized there was a link between them, that we could use frontline responders or journalists and train them to take testimonies of witnesses of appalling crimes and then help prosecutors to build cases. And that's what we do at the Reckoning Project. The other thing I would say is after 2008, the newspaper industry crashed. And there were more and more bloggers, as they were called then. Twitter wasn't what it is now, but people weren't reading newspapers. And I came of age when you went out and you bought a stack at the local newsagent. You bought the FT, you bought the New York Times, you bought the Washington Post, you bought the Times of London, you bought the Guardian, and you had them, and you sat down on your sofa and you read them, or you skimmed them, and you really had a good understanding of what was going on in the world. And then in addition to that, you might read Foreign Affairs and you might read Newsweek. But slowly people weren't doing that anymore, and they were getting their news off Twitter. And I taught at Yale for 4 years, so like the brightest kids in the world, and they were reading, their news source was Twitter. I never kind of mastered the art of blogging, nor did I want to, but I did know that people were evolving and that news no longer had the impact. Now, today I just picked up a horrific story in The Guardian that CNN's agenda from on high has kind of limited journalists, sorry for that, told their journalists there is an agenda when reporting the Israel-Gaza war, and that they've been told, like anything Israeli spokespeople say, you take it completely at liberty, but do not quote any Palestinians, do not give their side of the story. I mean, they literally have been told this, and some of the very brave ones have come forward and said this is journalistic malpractice. Now, I came of age, and I'm so lucky in what I call the golden age of journalism, when you did what you wanted to. Things are so politicized now that so many journalists are either afraid to speak out, or human rights just doesn't matter the way it used to. So at the Reckoning Project, what we really aim to do is to stamp out impunity so that victims of terrible, terrible crimes do not feel that they will never see justice, or that no one knows about it, And I think that's the biggest pain that people have, is that they feel, I've undergone something horrific. My home was bombed. 22 members of my family were killed. We are all starving to death right now, eating soup made from leaves. And yet no one hears what is happening to us. Do you know how that would feel not to have a voice? So in a very, very small way, what we are doing is trying to give back a voice to people.
So I'm a bit unclear as to how journalists fit into the Reckoning Project's stated purpose. I mean, on the website, on the Reckoning Project's website, it says that the project, and I quote, brings on the ground investigative journalists who collect witness testimonies from sites of human rights violations, war crimes, and atrocities. Together with lawyers, they work together to stamp out impunity through the courts of law, courts of public opinion, and available accountability pathways. Um, Obviously, that ambition, as it relates to journalism, would conflict with the traditional notion of the reporter or correspondent as objective observer, whose job it is not to take sides, but rather to simply report the facts as they know them or as they see them. Conversely, if I'm not mistaken, you've also stated that the Reckoning Project's fact gatherers were journalists who you've trained as war crime investigators with the intent of bringing cases specifically against Putin at the World Court at The Hague. So could you just please
Sure.
clarify how that works for us?
Okay.
The mechanism.
So they, can I just turn something off because it's driving me crazy? A
Sure.
beep. 1 second. My washing machine. Thank you. So we recruit investigative journalists, but they could also be lawyers. They could also be social work. Social workers are very, very good at interviewing. I did this project in not exactly the same way, but in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and I trained doctors, mainly first responders, how to take testimonies. So the point is, it's people who are on the ground already. In the case of the Reckoning Project, we only use Ukrainians. So we do not use, let's say, an American journalist who wants to participate in this. They have to be Ukrainian because of the trust issue and also for capacity building, because we believe that Ukrainians should have an important role in their own justice system. And oftentimes during war, human rights organizations or international organizations or NGOs arrive, and they're foreigners, and they kind of take stock of the country. And we didn't want that. We wanted Ukrainians to have their own sense of agency over what's happened, these terrible things that are happening there. So they were journalists, and now, I mean, they go through a quite rigorous training that we give them, which is a combination of international humanitarian law, in trauma, both how not to re-traumatize victims when they're talking to them. For instance, victims of sexual violence, you can't just go and that stupid thing you see TV journalists doing all the time, how do you feel? There's a whole protocol you have to follow for people who are deeply traumatized. Or, for instance, after a bombing, you can't just run up to someone who's literally in shock and take a testimony, because it will not stand up in court. So they are then trained in our methodology. They're given, it's a template, but I guess you could think of it as a questionnaire, which is a typical way. Let's say you were doing a survey of quantitative, qualitative analysis, but our questionnaire would say things like, what did you see? And it goes into detail, because what we need to help the prosecutors is, what were the soldiers wearing? What were their accents like? What did they look like? What were their voices like? Were they polite to you? And if not, how so? But we don't ask leading questions, which journalists often do. So, a journalist, without even realizing it, will sometimes put words into someone's mouth. And, most notably, you see when you watch TV talk shows, you see, them leading someone into a trap. And so they don't do this. It's very straightforward. a legal testimony. They often go back 3 or 4 times to verify points. People who have been imprisoned or tortured, sometimes their memories aren't good. We teach them how to help people who are in trauma to set their timeline. Sense of time when people are traumatized is often very distorted. So personally, me, what I would do when I would interview people and they couldn't remember when it was, and I'd say, was it cold out? Was it winter? Was there snow on the ground, or was it warm? Do you remember what they were wearing? So that's how we work. And then we verify it, and we use OSINT and various verification tools, which I'm not a computer scientist, so I'm not going to go into it here. I have a chief data analyst who is Syrian and absolutely extraordinary, Raji Abdel Salam. He helped build other war crime tribunals. So he's very skilled in verification of documentation of war crimes. And then we develop relationships with various prosecutors. So we work with mainly the Ukrainian prosecutor general. We are very careful not to damage any ongoing investigations they might have. So, for instance, we are working right now for the next year on the stolen Ukrainian children, of which there are 19,000, we believe. There might be more. And we have a very set methodology for our team. We have about 30 people on the ground. And we're going to get 100 testimonies, but we do not, at this stage, not yet, we're not interviewing children. Why? Because children, if you interview them and it's going to go to the courts, you need to have a psychologist or a member of the law enforcement with you. So we have told our research team very strictly, do not go near children. The children that have come back, the Ukrainian children that went to Russia and were brought back. Instead, they're interviewing all the witnesses around it, the parents, the people who drove the bus and took the kids to Russia. Many of the children were taken from care facilities, so they had special needs or they were orphans. So the people who ran the homes, the doctors who treated the children. So we're doing a complete investigation. When we're done, we will give that to the prosecutor general, and he will weave it into his case. As you know, Vladimir Putin is indicted in The Hague for the deportation of Ukrainian children. So in a nutshell, that's how we work. That's the legal side of it. The other side of it, which is the media content, is that some of those testimonies, not all of them, but some of them we use to create media stories so that the story of Ukraine does not get out of the public mind or the court of public opinion, as we call it. So, for instance, the cover of Time magazine, we did a big story on a village called Yehidny, where the entire village was put in a basement for a month, the entire village, without toilets, without showers. The Russians basically herded them up, put them in a basement. So we did a huge story based on our testimonies of witnesses who were inside the basement. It was very powerful. We did big media stories on the Mariupol hospital, which got bombed, the maternity hospital. We've had stories in the Atlantic, in Foreign Affairs, in the New York Times, in the Washington Post. So we use that as well as a way of keeping Ukraine factual and making sure the narrative that comes from the Kremlin, which, as you know, the Kremlin is the greatest disinformation machine in the world, one of. And they are basically, our stories counter that because, evidence and facts don't lie. So that's how the Reckoning Project works.
So the project was stood up 2 years ago, approximately, yes? In that time, have you has through the conduit of Ukrainian prosecutors, have you been able to actually bring cases before the World Court?
We're working on them now. I mean, we were, our research, we were among the first that documented the children being stolen before the numbers were counted, before, satellite imagery showed where the kids were. So we were literally in the first group of people that reported it. So that led eventually, that and many other things, including the work that the Yale Conflict Observatory did, incredible stuff, satellite imagery, led to Putin's indictment. So, we have impact. We weren't the only cause of it, but we were part of the group of people that worked on that. We are now building a universal jurisdiction case in Argentina on torture. Universal jurisdiction is a way of trying perpetrators in other countries. So, for instance, the first Syrian war crimes trial, Koblenz, it was called Koblenz because it was tried in Germany, in jurisdictions that are friendly. I use that in quotes, but where you think you could win the case. So, Argentina has a precedent of torture, of course, of trying that, and it's important for us to reach the global South, because the global South is not on the side of Ukraine. Traditionally, the global South supports any kind of anti-Western alliance or coalition. And in places like Argentina or Mexico or Africa or parts of the Middle East, it's seen as a NATO war. That the NATO provoked Putin by expanding. And what did he do? He invaded Ukraine and took back what he sees as Russian territory. So by working in those places, we're able to kind of push the message of Ukraine, that Ukraine has a right to sovereignty and territorial integrity beyond the geographical maps of Ukraine. We're kind of getting our voice even louder.
I'm curious what percentage of your field investigators are women?
A lot of them.
And why is that?
Because the men are on the front lines, because Ukrainian men are mobilized. Although this year we just recruited and trained a whole new group for the German. It's our project is funded by the German government on the children, so we call it the German grant. It's just our insider, the German grant, but really the children project. We had a few men. We had 4 lawyers actually. Is there any way I could take this call? It's my son. He's at the hospital. He has a concussion. Can we break for a minute? Is that possible?
Sure.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
No, not a problem.
Thank you.
All right. I read that somewhere that when you went to Sarajevo, you said that nothing could have prepared you for, experiencing what life was like in the 20th century in a city that was under siege the way Sarajevo was. And then I read that you went to Rwanda, where you were filled with, and I quote here, a kind of horror and a sense of what evil is. To this day, my life's work is about trying to find the nature of evil. What did you mean by that? I mean, why is it so important that we understand what evil is?
Because I think there's a capability for everyone to have this kind of deep darkness. And when rule of law disappears, then you have anarchy, and then you have people running wild, and then you have darkness. And so, over the years, what I have seen is it's almost, people always ask me to talk about it, and I never really do or can. I mean, I'll get on something like this and I'll go around it, but the kind of darkness the things that man can do to man, it never ceases to shock me. The levels of torture or inhumanity or cruelty against your fellow man. And I read this unbelievably beautiful thing this morning by Pablo Casals, and can I read it to you? I mean, it will.
Sure, please.
I think it'll take about 3 seconds, but I think it's really worth it because it's just so beautiful. No, I can't find it. It's okay. We can keep going. But it was basically saying, look at children. Look at children being born. How perfect they are. How beautiful they are. How look at their everything shaped so beautifully. But then think of that child growing up and hurting another human being who is a marvel like they are. No, I can't find it. Unfortunately, I wish I had saved it. Anyway, sorry about that.
That's okay. I mean, was there a crystalline moment early in your career, specifically as a journalist, where you realized that that dark capacity that you alluded to a moment ago, a you know a specific situation where you found yourself and it hit you with full force that this was the capacity of mankind?
I would say probably. I mean, the siege of Sarajevo was pretty horrific, right? And the level of suffering, you in some way, I whenever I meet a man of the cloth, whether he's a rabbi or a priest or an imam, I always say, I do believe in God, and I know there's a God, but how can He allow this kind of suffering? Um, and they never answer me. I mean, they always have some kind of theological explanation that never makes sense. It's always about free will, and that we all have the free will to act on it or not. So I've never really gotten an answer that satisfies me yet, and I hope before I die I will. But I think that there was no one moment, but it would probably have occurred in the period 1994 to 95, when there was the Rwandan genocide, and a year later the genocide of Srebrenica. And I think genocide kicks it all up to another level, because that is the desire to eradicate people, to push them off the face of the earth, and that kind of level of hatred and systematic intent is terrifying. And how quickly like the thing that really shocked me about Bosnia and about Rwanda too. I mean, of course, there's underlying political motives and things take a while to brew, but how quickly people's lives go from being comfortable, electricity, to anarchy and chaos. And that's why during COVID, I think I reacted in a way that other people might not have, because I've seen, what happens when there's no water left and when there's no food on the shelves, and what people do when you cannot leave the city. When you can't get out, when the city is encircled and you are besieged, and then you're stuck there, or when the hospitals run out of painkillers. So, I mean, my worst case scenarios were running through my head. Of course, like everyone was storing toilet paper. I stored water, but I didn't hoard stuff, because I also know that when people hoard stuff, it's really unfair economically, because it means that people who are poor can't do that, and they're not going to get the water. So COVID brought out, I think, the worst and the best in people. I mean, we had tremendous medical workers who were heroes, but it brought out the worst in people as well, I think. And it was a kind of lesson for Western rich countries who have never gone through war or strife, to understand how terrifying it is when you cannot protect yourself. And that's what happens to people in wartime.
You have a son, Luca, who was born in 2004. 4 months after he was born, you went to Baghdad to report on the immediate
Right.
aftermath, the fall of Saddam Hussein, and the chaos that was ensuing in Iraq. Um, what compelled you to leave your infant son and place yourself yet again in a position of harm's way?
You know what? I'll be really honest with you. And since Me Too is now an issue, I didn't want to go. I was forced to go by my male bosses, who were complete jerks, and who were really macho. And I was one of the only female war reporters at that stage. I mean, now you have many women doing great jobs, especially TV has a lot of women who, stand up with their helmet and like to get filmed like that. But in my day, there really weren't many, right? And the ones who were often very, very tough, kind of unpleasant, not supportive of other women. And I really wanted to have a baby. And I had this beautiful little boy, and I wanted to stay home with him. I'd paid my dues. I'd been working my whole life, and not just working in, you know, a nice job where I came home at night. I was in the field my entire career. And Luca, I didn't want to go, and they called me and they said, "Oh, you've got to go to Baghdad because we don't have people who are trained to be war reporters, and it would put them in danger if we sent them there." So I was like, "Yeah, so you're sending me?" So they basically sent me there, and one night I overheard. Um, there was already a guy there who shall go unnamed, but a real double jerk, and I was up in a room. I was breastfeeding, so I was pumping into a sink and crying because I missed my infant so much, and I felt like it was such a waste. And I wasn't a young mother, and I'd waited a long time to have this baby, and I heard him on the satellite phone to our bosses back in London going, "Yeah, she's lost her nerve. Let's send her to Sadr City to check on the kidnapping." So they were just like a bunch of like macho jerks who kind of ran the news industry in those days. And, lots changed since then, but a lot hasn't. And the field that I was in was primarily male. And the women, my colleague was Marie Colvin, who was killed in Homs.
Legendary.
Yep. And she never had children. She had a terrible alcohol problem. The bosses basically, she didn't want to go to Syria where she died, and she felt tremendous pressure to go. So how did I feel leaving my baby? I felt awful. I cried every night. I missed him terribly. But my husband at the time, and we separated when Luca was 4, said, you should do this because it will show you how you want to live your life and how you want to balance it as a mother and as a war reporter. You'll know then that you're unable to be apart from him, or maybe you'll love it and you'll want to go back to work. He said, but either way, you have to determine how you're going to map out your life. So it was a very pivotal moment for me.
Was he right?
He was right. And I realized that I wanted to stay home with him when he was little, and that I had to work financially. I had married another journalist. We weren't bankers, so I had to work. But I worked out a way of working, I guess, when he was about 9 months old, that I would go on assignments and I would prepare everything in advance. And instead of staying for 3 months or even 2 weeks, as I had in the past, I would do everything like within a week. So I'd land in Pakistan. I would have set up every meeting in advance. And then I would have hit the ground running, worked day and night, got everything done, and got back on the plane to be with my baby. And that was the way I supported myself. So I did that. I did it most of his growing up years. And then after 2008, when the newspaper business crashed, I just had to be creative and do other things. And that's when I started working for international organizations like the UN and doing consulting for people and starting to branch out. And then in 2015, I got a scholarship to do this amazing, another master's degree in international relations at the Fletcher School of Law at Tufts University. And it was just life-changing. It was like a mid-career degree in mainly international law. And that's I could not do the job I do now without having gone to this remarkable place.
So let's just back up just a moment. I mean, because I read that when you did make that transition and began working for the UN, you discovered, I can't remember the exact language you used, but it wasn't particularly flattering as far as the the capacity of the UN to actually achieve some good effect. What was your impression when you did go to the UN, and what was deficient about their effort?
Look, we need the UN. It is the parliament of man, right? It is global government, and it is creaky and it needs massive reform. But at the end of the day, what Antonio Guterres says matters. And he has been tremendous on the Gaza war. He has called out time and time again the Israelis. He stood up to them in a way that no one else has. They have issues. It's a massive organization, and each agency is very different. UN Women is different from UN Refugee Agency. I was frustrated by the waste. I mean, but it is, again, I have an organization of 30 people, so we're really nimble. If something happens, we go. We don't need to follow protocol. We don't need to go through, the UN. If you need to take a trip, you have to go through so much paperwork before you even get on the ground. And then you get on the ground and you're not allowed to do so many things. My researchers, if something happens overnight, they're in a car the next day driving there. We do have security protocols, of course, but basically we're free agents. We're an NGO, but we operate in a much more nimble way. So the UN is clunky and it's big, but I think at its core are intentions that are really good. And what it was set up to do was to prevent war and to help end wars. And now Syria was a really painful topic for many of us because the UN office on Syria is still open. It's in Geneva, but have you thought about Syria in the past, 5 years? It's gone completely forgotten, and yet hundreds of thousands of people were killed, and Assad is still in power. So, it's easy to slag off the UN, but I learned a lot there too, and I went on from the UN to work for the Council on Foreign Relations. And that honed my skills in another way. And from there, I was recruited to go to Yale. And I spent 4 incredibly happy years at the Yale Jackson Institute, now the Jackson School of Global Affairs, teaching human rights. And I learned so much from my students, and I learned so much from my colleagues there. And it allowed me to put an academic context into the work that I spent my entire life doing. So, I think everyone's life kind of has layers and passages. And when I look back on mine, didn't mean to become a journalist, became a journalist. Went from there to working for UN and places like that. Then from there to the Council on Foreign Relations is an NGO, but it's probably more conservative than I am. And from there to one of the greatest academic institutions in the world. And all of it contributed so much to make me do the job I do now at the Reckoning Project, or I could never have done it.
So you had alluded earlier in our conversation about the fact that most people, certainly most Americans, have never known firsthand what war is, what it sounds like, what it looks
Thank
like,
God.
what it smells like, right? But you have in spades. How have those experiences affected you on a personal level? How have they shaped you as a person?
Well, I think my parameters for things are probably so different from yours, that in a way of what fear is to me, one thing that's really important, I never, ever, ever take anything for granted, like electricity, water, heating, and food. So, I have a lot of lights on now because we're here, but in Sarajevo, I didn't take a shower for 6 or 7 weeks, really. So when I get under a shower now, every day, I think, oh my God. Or I've lived in Africa where there's no water or there's nowhere to flush a loo, and you have to find water and pump it with your hand in a can or something. I've been in places where there's no electricity, where there's no lights, where you live by candlelight, where you have a flashlight. To this day, I carry a flashlight with me everywhere, even though we have cell phones now. But, cell phones run out. I tend to think of the worst case scenario, but maybe that's not a bad thing. Like if I go into a movie theater, I look where the exits are. Always. I look who's next to me, who's on my right, who's on my left, because I might have to help them, or they might have to help me, or they might put me in danger. My alertness for danger is very strong. I have very good intuition, which has kept me alive, but I also, my reflexes are very, like, if I hear a noise, I'm under a table very quickly, and I remember going to a chiropractor and he couldn't crack me because he said my reflexes were too quick. My awareness of something going wrong. I've been in so many bombing raids, so I know, um, maybe my trust of people, although I don't know, because I'm still despite it all, I'm a very optimistic person. Believe it or not, I'm quite a cheerful person. I'm very grateful for so many things, whether it's like a blue sky, a bird singing in the morning, seeing a kid laughing in the street. So I have a great capacity for enjoying life. And I think that comes from war zones, because it's not about consumption or how much you can buy or whether you have the best iPhone or whether you're skiing the Black Diamond Run. It's about what you have in front of you and your capacity for enjoyment. Because even in Sarajevo, in the worst days, or even in Gaza now, I speak to some of my friends and they have small children, right? So they've got to keep the kids entertained. And like, I saw a video one sent me of, there was one guy pretending to be a clown trying to keep the kids. You have to find ways to survive and keep yourself alive, but you also have to find ways to keep yourself mentally prepared and mentally happy, because human beings cannot live in a state of complete darkness and misery, or they will die. I was always told the story of, I think it's a rare tribe of Amazonian indigenous people who, if imprisoned, die because they're unable, in the way that they live, they don't see the future. They cannot project a future. So they can never project that they would ever be released from prison. To them, it's only the moment now. And if you put them in prison, put them in an enclosed space, they literally die. And so I try, because of my long experience in war, to never take anything for granted. Never. The fact that my son is in good health, or that we have a roof over our head. So I guess I don't complain as much as other people might. I have a sibling who complains a lot. And I always just say to her, you have a roof over your head. You have food on the table. What are you talking about? And she always says, you've been around too many refugees. But, if you see people and you work with people constantly who have lost everything, and I mean everything, then you don't want, first of all, you don't want many possessions because you want to be able to pick up and run quickly. And also you realize that we are less than the 1%. If you're listening to this right now, then you are the 1%, because you have electricity, you know about it. So you're in a community of probably intellectual, thinking, caring people. And you're in your home. And, most of the world's populations do not actually have homes. So, long answer to your question.
So it sounds to me like if you had to synthesize what I learned having parachuted, so to speak, into all of these, conflict areas over the span of so many years, would it be the notion of appreciating what you have?
Absolutely. And, I was at the World Economic Forum about 10 days ago, and I met a consultant from Bain, which is one of these big consulting firms. And he said to me, he came to a panel that I was on, and he came up to me after and he said, I spend my life counseling businessmen that make huge amounts of money, but they hit an age, businessmen or women, where their life is not purposeful. Like they've made so much money and they've changed business practices or whatever, they're hedge fund managers, but they begin to feel like they're now on the road down to the other side of the road, and they have not felt that they've lived a meaningful life or an examined life. And when I was very young, I remember reading a line by Plato, an unexamined life is not worth living. I've really examined my life, and I examine it every day. I examine my life and I feel like I've lived a purpose-driven life. Don't have a lot of money, and there's many things I can't do, but I know on my deathbed, I will feel that I touched individual people by just, letting them know that there was someone out there who was listening to them and who was trying to help them. Even if I failed, I tried, and that, I think, as human beings, we're not put on this earth just to live for ourselves. I think we are meant to help the people around us, in your community, in your family. The homeless guy in the street, I don't know. Everyone has an individual threshold of what you can and cannot do. But to live a life where you do not reach out and do that is, to me, a shame. So I don't know if that synthesizes it for you, but
It does well. Thank you.
Tried.
So one last question. Hemingway once said, "Never think that war, no matter how necessary nor how justified, is not a crime." Hemingway aside, are there ever instances, in your opinion, where war is ever justified?
There are just wars. I mean, there's a wonderful book by Michael Walzer called Just and Unjust Wars. In my memory, the wars, I suppose World War II is always looked at as the war that was justified and was a moral and just war. And we were on the right side. But I don't think I could say that about Afghanistan or Iraq, because those countries were so brutally broken. And yet, anything that comes from revenge, and that's what Afghanistan and Iraq was. It was revenge for September 11th. And what Israel is doing to Hamas now is revenge for October 7th, which was horrific. And I have to say, because I've spoken a lot about Gaza, October 7th was horrific, and the hostages must come home. But that is no reason to kill that many people in vengeance and in anger. And that's what it is now. It is such an unjust war. So, there was a just war, actually. I can give you one example, and it's so remote, I bet very few people listening to this will know about it. In 2000, Sierra Leone, tiny little West African country, had been besieged by a 14-year war, which was horrific, and it mainly was attacks against civilians by the rebel forces who were cutting off their hands or cutting them off at the elbow, to make civilians this kind of grotesque symbol of their power. It was an awful war. Anyway, the rebels, who were called the RUF, were closing in on the capital, and the people were freaking out, as you can imagine, grabbing their babies, putting them on their backs, running, trying to run away to villages were burning. It was like Mad Max. It was just the most scary thing and terrifying. A small group of British soldiers arrived, because Sierra Leone had been a British colony. Small group led by a rare soldier he was Brigadier David Richards. He went on to lead NATO in Afghanistan and to lead all of the British forces. But then, he was 10 years younger, he was a brigadier. He made the decision to throw away his cell phone, not listen to his commanders, and save Sierra Leone. And this small group of special forces British soldiers, within 24 hours, had taken back the airport, which is strategic, secured perimeters, protected the civilians, and basically led to the end of the war. It's a case study. If anyone wants to read about it, I wrote about it in the New York Review of Books. It's called Case Study Sierra Leone 2000. That is a just war. That is a war that was basically to protect civilians. And to me, at the heart of every war, at the heart of everything, is how do you protect civilians? What do you put in place so that civilians are not harmed? Biden's attack on Iraq 2 days ago, in response to the terrible thing that happened in Jordan, killed 16 civilians. How would you feel if that was you? That was your home, that was your brother, that was your sister, and you're just killed by a random bomb? You know, it is our obligation to protect civilians. So, I mean, Sierra Leone is a really good example of a war that was just and that ended quickly and led to peace. And to this day, 24 years later, Sierra Leone is at peace. So that's a great story.
Janine, thank you so much. And please keep up the good work.
Thank you so much. It's been great.
A pleasure. Thank you
Bye.
again.
Thank you, Janine and Dave, for a truly enlightening conversation. I don't doubt that it will serve us all well as we try to navigate ongoing events around the globe. And thank you all, wherever you may be in the world, for being with us today at the St. Helena Forum. To learn more about the Reckoning Project, go to thereckoningproject.com. And to find out more about Janine's work and how to find her books, visit JanineDiGiovanni.com. And to learn more about Dave Fried and how you can find his books, go to davidfried.com. For additional links on the subject of today's presentation and for news about upcoming forum programs, and we've got some really good ones coming, please visit our website at shforum.org. As we say goodbye, we'd like to thank the following people for their generosity in making the St. Helena Forum and its continuing programs possible.